Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today on Read Smart, the official podcast for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. We're now approaching the winner announcement on the 19th of November and are speaking to all 6 shortlisted authors about their brilliant works. Today, we're joined by Viet Thanh Nguyễn, who is author of A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial. Nguyen is also the author of the short story collection The Refugees and the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Sympathizer. His accolades include the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Edgar Award and the Andrew Carnegie Medal. His other books are Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, a finalist for the National Book Award in Non-Fiction, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. He's a professor at the University of Southern California. In A Man of Two Faces, Nguyen rewinds the film of his life with insight, humour and lyricism. He blends personal memoir with larger stories of refugeehood and colonisation, writing with sardonic wit and deep emotional openness about his life as a father and as a son. This memoir explores the necessity of memory and forgetting, the promises and failures of America, and the exceptional life of this brilliant author. Welcome, Viet. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Georgina, thanks for that very kind introduction.
I wonder if we could start with asking about the ways in which A Man of Two Faces explores the concept of dual identity.
I grew up in the United States as a refugee, having come from Vietnam, fleeing in 1975 when I was 4 years of age. And I think I had a pretty typical experience for a lot of people who would be called minorities or people of color and so on in the United States, where there was always a sense of duality, this sense of understanding that we as Vietnamese people looked at ourselves in one way and the rest of the United States or the rest of the world looked at us in another way. That was brought home to me vividly pretty much every day of my life, I think. I grew up in a household where my parents said, you are 100% Vietnamese. And then I would step out into the rest of the American world and feel like I was an American. So I felt like an American spying on my parents. But outside of the household, their lessons really shaped me because I felt like a Vietnamese spying on Americans in reverse. So that sense of personal duality, I felt also meshed with my understanding of how the United States operated, that this duality was not simply an individual feeling or even something specific in my family and community, but was structural in the United States, that many other people had gone through this before me as well.
And I mean, you write in the book about, for instance, Apocalypse Now, and talking about you as a Vietnamese American being both victim and perpetrator.
I totally identified with American culture. When I was watching American movies, I saw myself as an American. This was especially vivid, obviously, in watching war movies where I was rooting for American soldiers until this movie, Apocalypse Now. And when the American soldiers in that movie killed Vietnamese civilians, I felt split in two because I didn't know whether I should identify with the Americans doing the killing or the Vietnamese being killed. And that may seem very minor because I'm talking about a movie, but in fact, I think it had a really traumatic effect on me, shook me to my core, and I had to put that feeling away because I was only 11 or 12 when I watched that movie. But looking back on it later as a younger adult, I really did understand that Apocalypse Now and all these other movies like it, because the United States made so many movies about the Vietnam War. It was fighting the war again in memory, and it was exporting this memory all over the world. So it wasn't just an American phenomenon, but that all of these collective movies and what they represented about the American imagination and American memory had put me into a very difficult and contradictory situation that it would take a long time to understand, much less resolve.
And I mean, even when you're talking about childhood games, Cowboys and Indians, that idea of exporting this genocidal mindset to the rest of the world. There isn't, I'm sure there must be a few, but very few cultures in the world where children don't play Cowboys and Indians.
Absolutely. And I was growing up watching American cowboy and Indian movies, Westerns, which were just part of the standard cultural fare of my generation, not realizing that this was basically American propaganda. I mean, the United States was built on the massacre of Indian peoples, indigenous peoples, and the appropriation of their lands and so forth. And for Americans, we just took that for granted. That was just a part of our our daily entertainment. And you're absolutely right that this has been a very powerful American cultural export. I don't think much of the world is able to export its founding mythologies in the same way, except imperial powers like France and the UK. But, I visited Paris a couple of years ago, took my kids to a major children's amusement park, and one of the rides was a cowboys and Indians ride where children could get into canoes and they were looking at images of 19th century, 18th century indigenous peoples with feather headdresses. I mean, this is how powerful these images are, and they're still present in the world.
And to bring it back to your specific community, I wonder how you reconcile the different versions of memory within the Vietnamese refugee community and the American perspective.
Well, I grew up feeling very excluded from the American perspective of memory because, again, it was obvious that when Americans said the word Vietnam, they meant the Vietnam War, and when they said the Vietnam War, they meant the war for Americans and this conflict in the American soul. And that was also, I think, again, exported to the rest of the world as well. So I wanted to, write stories, write books that would talk about the Vietnamese perspective. But the more I delved into the Vietnamese perspective, the more I realized we were guilty of some of the same problems, which is just as Americans wanted to remember themselves and forget others, the Vietnamese of the United States, the refugees, wanted to do the same thing. And then when I went to Vietnam, I realized, well, the Vietnamese who won in Vietnam are doing the same thing. They are also forgetting Americans, but certainly erasing the Vietnamese who fled as well. So I became much more interested, not in the idea of simply filling in the gaps of memory with whoever's been excluded, but understanding the very dynamic of memory and forgetting itself as being central to pretty much every culture and nation that I've encountered, especially when it comes to narratives of war and nation building.
I wonder what challenges you faced in structuring the memoir, especially when it comes to dealing with deeply personal and then historical content.
I wrote this book very intuitively for the most part, and that meant that it was actually a lot of fun. It didn't take a lot of time to write the first 2/3 of the book where I was delving into my own experiences and what it meant to be an American and what it meant to be a son to my Vietnamese refugee parents. And my relationship to memory was very important here because I have a very fragmented relationship to memory. I don't look back on my life and have some sort of perfect A to Z linear narrative of who I am. My memories come to me in bits and pieces, and I have to work very hard to reconstruct them. And there are lots of gaps and absences. And I wanted the book to express that at the level of its writing, in addition to what I was saying. So the book is very playful, I hope. There's a lot of use of short lines and poetic looking arrangements and fragments and so on, which I think is not very typical for a lot of memoirs, but I don't think it's actually very difficult to read once you actually encounter that on the page. The greatest difficulty came in the last third of the book because, as with most memoirs, and with most narratives, you have to build up to the most difficult part of the story or your life. And in that case, it was, in fact, what had happened, not just in terms of war to my parents and the displacements that happened and all that, but in fact that my mother was, I think, very psychically damaged by these experiences and possibly also by whatever was unique to her as a human being. And she went to psychiatric facilities 3 times in her life. And it was very hard for me to grapple with those experiences for her, but also for me, and to try to figure out how to write about that. And so the last third of the book, I think, was very difficult to write, but also deeply emotional as a result of all of that.
I mean, it's so powerful to read, but there are also some really funny bits. And I mean, I particularly love when you go back to Vietnam and you're kind of grappling with the food and the culture, and you write it in a very amusing way.
I think when we look back on historical tragedies and so on, hopefully we have a greater sense of distance so we can see the absurdities and the contradictions and therefore have a sense of humor about them. When we're living through them, it might be a lot more difficult. And trust me, as an American in our current environment, there's a lot that we should be laughing about, but it's also terrifying at the same time because we don't know the consequences. But looking back upon my own life, I could find the humor in war and tragedy and the refugee experience, and also in what you just described, which is the typical kind of culture clash narrative of the person who's out of their environment, whether it's me as a refugee in the United States or whether me as a returnee to Vietnam. So, for example, my Vietnamese is not great. I think it's okay to get around. So when I would go back to Vietnam, Vietnamese people would say to me, "Your Vietnamese is so good for a Korean." And you just have to laugh at that, right? And it is funny, even if there's a little bit of pain for that. as someone who does want to be seen as Vietnamese by other Vietnamese people.
You referenced the current political situation, and I wonder in what ways do you hope that A Man of Two Faces will contribute to the conversation about the refugee experience and collective memory? Of course, that's very much coming under the spotlight at the moment.
I think that, refugees are a challenge to the United States, but also to much of the world. And I use that word very deliberately because typically we talk about refugees as a crisis. They're a problem. They themselves are a problem. And that helps to distract host countries like the United States, the UK, France, and so on, from considering the very serious contradiction that these countries are, in fact, the problem, that they have helped to produce in so many ways refugees themselves through their policies of war, intervention, colonialism, overconsumption, capitalism, and so on. So that's the challenge that refugees offer. And it's a very important challenge because even in the time period in which I've been thinking seriously about this issue for the past 8 or 9 years, the official calculations of refugee populations from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees has grown from somewhere around 20 million to 44 million or so refugees. That's just in 8 years, and that doesn't include populations that are displaced who are not officially classified as refugees. So I think that this is actually very, very going to be has been important and will be important because political leaders like Donald Trump, but also the far right in other European countries and so on and elsewhere, have demonized refugees, used them as a scapegoat in order to distract their populations from the fact that the economic and cultural crises that they're undergoing have nothing to do with refugees.
Yeah. I wonder how your background as a novelist and also as a scholar and academic informed the narrative style and the thematic exploration in the memoir.
As a novelist and as a scholar, as someone who's done a lot of work on American literature and Asian American literature and post-colonial literature, I'm deeply attracted not just to content, like the fact that all of us have important stories to tell, but I'm attracted to form, which is how do we express those stories? And I think form for me is just as important, possibly more important than the content. And when I talked about refugees, for example, I'm so not interested in telling my refugee experience because I am a refugee. I'm not interested in reading refugee narratives because people are refugees. Those stories have to be told, but I'm really interested in the most experimental forms of writing that look at refugee experiences and see how those experiences can actually shape the way that we tell stories about ourselves as refugees, but also tell stories about the countries where we came from and the host countries that receive us. So, for example, in the United States, and maybe in the UK too, it's typical that refugee narratives are expected to be narratives of closure. Like we've been forcibly displaced from somewhere. We've come to a beautiful country like the UK or the United States. And here we're going to be welcomed and we're going to be grateful and we're going to become productive parts of the country. That's a typical refugee narrative form that to me is completely uninteresting and again allows people who are not refugees to feel better about themselves. And in my own work, I'm interested in making people uncomfortable because I like to be uncomfortable when I read really wonderful works of literature. And I think that's what I want to pursue as a writer, but what I also want to find in refugee experiences as well.
Finally, what messages do you hope that readers take away from the memoir?
Part of the unsettling experience of writing about oneself is to discover the terror within oneself. I think that should make us all uncomfortable. If you as a reader ever meet someone who tells you, I really want to write my memoir, you should run in the other direction because that is kind of a scary person. They don't understand that to write a memoir is a horrible experience. I would not want to wish upon anybody a life where they would feel compelled to write a memoir because it means you've been deeply unsettled in some way and it's still embedded within yourself. And so to write a memoir is really about a deep confrontation with the fears and terrors within us. And also to write a memoir is not just about oneself, it's about everyone else that has shaped you. And so for me, to write this memoir has been about truth and betrayal. I've had to discover the truth about myself, which means betraying myself. I've had to betray people like my mother who never wanted to be a part of my memoir. I've had to tell the truth that I perceive about the United States, which many Americans would regard as a betrayal. So that's the lesson. Truth is uncomfortable, and many people do not want us to tell that story, which is why we turn to the most compelling memoirs for that kind of confrontation.
Viet, thank you so much. That was just wonderful. That's Viet Thanh Nguyen, and his book is A Man of Two Faces. We'd like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued generous support of this podcast. The winner will be announced on Tuesday, the 19th of November, at an awards ceremony generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. The announcement will also be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction social channels. If you're interested in finding out more about the shortlisted books, you can visit our website or follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at BG Prize. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening. Until next time. Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.